Professor Emeritus at City University of New York at a graduate school. I headed the sociology department for about 12 years. I also ran something called the Socialist Scholars Conference for 25 years. That mostly ran here at Cooper Union, that brought activists and scholars from Europe and all over the world. And I ran a large NGO, non-government organization in the Balkans, based in Zagreb, Croatia, which fights for the return of refugees to Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnia, for civil society, for rights of women, gays.
And how, I had read that he perhaps had medications that weren't prescribed to him by doctors, and I wondered
yes, that was one of the stories was that he was taking medication that the Dutch doctors were giving him because he wanted to put pressure on the court to let him go to Moscow for his cure. And of course, the court was worried that he'd never come back, which is quite likely. That's where his wife and his son are. We have to be very careful about Milosevic, one thing. He was a murderous, strong man and an authoritarian, but he was not a dictator in a normal sense of the word. First place, he was elected. And he was elected in reasonably fair elections 3 times in a row. He's unfortunately an accurate reflection of the nationalism of the Serbian electorate at that point in time. Also, while he's responsible for probably close to 150,000 deaths in Bosnia and Croatia and in Kosovo, the Albanian province of Serbia, his dictatorship was strange in the sense that relatively few people got touched by it in Belgrade and the big cities. If you were reasonably prominent as a journalist and intellectual and so on, probably nothing terrible would happen to you. They would not touch you because he was extremely media conscious. Once he said, when he was asked how he stayed in power, he says, look, the papers, to be sure, are against me, but only 15% of Serbs read the papers, and those vote against me anyhow. I control TV.
And everyone watches TV.
Right. And, you know, it's a frightening thought because it makes me think about our scene here and the difference between the far Christian right and the more sensible and liberal majority, because I think in America on social issues, we're liberal. We're much more tolerant and liberal than the policies of our government would indicate. But television is not controlled by majorities, it's controlled by those who pay, and it does not really reflect the views of the American public. It shapes them, it doesn't follow them.
Now, how long do you think Milosevic's trial would have gone on?
It was supposed to only go on maybe a month or so. He had delayed and delayed and delayed, so it lasted 4 years, which meant it stopped being news. And it was boring as all hell by the end. The court, in my opinion, was excessively tolerant of those tactics. It treated it like a regular trial rather than like the Nuremberg trials, which in a much shorter time got rid of 21 war criminals. I have no doubt whatsoever that Milosevic was a war criminal, but he was allowed to bully witnesses.
And do you think he would have been convicted?
Oh yeah, I have no doubt that he would have been convicted. I think that the prosecutor made a terrible mistake in raising 66 accusations, which took forever to prove. If you're going to do that, they should have picked up the 5 or 6 most serious ones, documented it, and gotten it over with. But I think that the difficulty is that bureaucrats and lawyers like, you know, to be extremely detailed, and they didn't understand how that looked to the public. It looked to the public like Milosevic was running circles around the court. Secondly, I don't think the court should have tolerated him defending himself. If he was claiming that he was too sick, then you can't defend yourself. You can't delay the court because of your decisions that jeopardize your health. I think the court's a great thing. I think we need that court. I think it's a scandal that the U.S. doesn't accept such courts, because obviously there could be all kinds of things raised against us on Guantanamo and on the whole war in Iraq, for that matter. I think the war in Iraq is full of war crimes. It's certainly not run according to the Hague Convention. The prisoners are not treated normally. And it was not a war that in any sense was authorized by the UN. It's not a defensive war.
Do you think it's important to complete the trial of Milosevic, even though he died, just for historical purposes, to come to a conclusion?
Well, look, we can be sea lawyers and say he was not convicted, so he died unconvicted. But the fact of the matter is, there is very little doubt that he's guilty. I think that any normal court procedure would have found him guilty in a much shorter time. I think it was because they were trying to compromise between the Anglo-Saxon and European conceptions of law that they ended up with this enormously complicated procedure. No, he is guilty. I was there. I was in Bosnia and Serbia and Croatia during the war, and there's absolutely no doubt that the war was supported by the Yugoslav army. And the Yugoslav army was under Milosevic's complete control. The money that the Bosnian Serbs had came from Belgrade. There were atrocities all over the place, including concentration camps. They were not death camps, but a lot of people did die in them. There were camps in which women were massively raped and kept there till they were their children. Villages were destroyed. Most of the casualties in the wars of Yugoslav succession were civilian. It's probably a ratio of 10 to 1. So it was a coward's war on all sides.
They were killing
civilians. They were killing each other villages. See, ethnic cleansing, which Milosevic and others were accused of, was not a consequence of the war. It was the purpose of the war. The purpose of the war was to redraw the ethnic boundaries, because ethnic boundaries are sloppy. They never quite fit with political boundaries. And what the Milosevic's allies in Bosnia and the Croats, on their part, wanted was to partition Bosnia in ethnically clean-cut areas. Impossible. The major population of Bosnia were Muslims. They were not particularly Muslims. There were a lot of people there who were Muslims who belonged to various dervish sects that were extremely tolerant and syncretic. In other words, that made a big emphasis of the people of the book, the Jews and the Christians, and they all had a common root ancestry. So, it was a horrendous war. What it did accomplish, among other things, ironically, was for the first time in history, it created a situation in which Muslims are now a majority in Bosnia.
Was the U.S. invasion, the trial of Milosevic, was it fair in the sense of, have all the parties that committed war crimes been equally and fairly treated, or have they treated the Serbs worse than the Croats and worse than others who might have?
Look, the CIA at one point said that 90% of the war crimes are committed by the Serbs and 10% by the Croats and the Muslims. I think they were not quite right. I would say 70-20 then. But it is true that it is clear that the lion's share of the crimes were committed by the Serbs. And one of the reasons was the Serbs are much better armed. The UN first response, which was to prohibit the importation of arms into the Bosnian war, a blockade, hurt the Muslims infinitely more than it hurt the Serbs and the Croats. I see. That's one thing. Second place, the U.S. did favor the Croats in the war. It did help them. It helped them train the troops. and it helped them in the counterattacks against the Serbs, which let the Croats engage in massive ethnic cleansing of the Serbs who lived in Croatia. That was one of the largest ethnic cleansings in Europe.
Was the U.S. war necessary? Was the U.S. invasion necessary?
What invasion?
Well, the U.S. bombing campaign,
well,
and the fact that we have Camp Bondsteel is there, for example.
Let's be very, very careful. The U.S. engaged, that is to say, NATO, under U.S. leadership, engaged in bombing of Serbia very late in the game. In my opinion, much too late in the game. Had NATO shown its teeth, had the European community said no in 1990 or 1991, you may partition, you may break up like the Soviet Union did, but you may not use force, there would be 250,000 people alive who are now not alive, and the Balkans would be infinitely more prosperous and stable. The fact is that the Europeans did not have the force and the willingness to use the force to use it, and the U.S. was considering Milosevic till very late in the game as a factor of stability, which is our weakness with strong men in various areas. They said, well, he's a bastard, but, you know, he's stable, and he speaks English well, and, you know, he knows how to lie properly, looks you in the eye, shakes your hands, and lies. The U.S. ambassador, the last U.S. ambassador, Zimmerman, read Milosevic right, but they didn't listen to him. He had called for intervention. I had called in 1991, just before the real shooting started, for the U.S. and French and British fleets to do a friendly visit to Dubrovnik, to anchor in the port of Dubrovnik. There would have certainly not been any bombing of Dubrovnik. Mm-hmm. All you needed was to put
a beautiful coastal city, a tourist destination,
an
ancient city.
Historic city, which is absolutely a non-military significance, which was bombed by the Serbs for all kinds of reasons, all of which are bad. Mm-hmm. Had the UN put in real forces, let's say 10,000 people, that's all. Between Serbs and Croats on the main borders, there would not have been a war between Serbs and Croats, really. There would have been local fights and so on. The difficulty was we gave the Yugoslav army, what was left of it, the feeling that we didn't really care. Mm-hmm. We didn't have a dog in that fight, as Baker said. And therefore, you know, while we would rather they didn't fight, we weren't going to do anything about it.
Was that the Clinton era's sort of fear of getting really that much involved in foreign policy? They weren't a very foreign policy oriented
presidency. Yeah, but remember what else was happening. The main point of our policy, it began with the Bush era, the Papa Bush, mm-hmm. Was what was happening in Russia. I mean, Yugoslavia had no nuclear weapons. It was a factor of destabilization, but not that big a factor of destabilization. On the other hand, you had the breakup of the Soviet Union with not one but 3 countries emerging which had nuclear weapons: Kazakhstan, Russia itself, and Ukraine, and lots of weapons of that. As a matter of fact, those weapons of the black market have been a curse for the next 10 years. Because the Russian army had nothing to pay its people with, so it kept selling
uranium,
spare weapons. Yeah. Well, and
there's some nuclear stuff floating around, conventional as well, yeah.
So we were mainly concerned with Russia. Second place, the Balkans always seemed to be troublesome, but never serious. You know, like they used to say in Vienna between the 2 world wars, the situation is catastrophic, but not serious. And it looked like, you know, that model too. The embassy in Belgrade had wanted $5 billion to give to the federal government so it would have a carrot mm-hmm. to offer to the republics to stay in. Mm-hmm. We thought it was too expensive. We ended up spending infinitely more money. Mm-hmm. You know, that's a case of being penny wise and pound foolish. But understand me, for example. I, in principle, don't think the U.S. should be the World Cup. I think there should be a World Cup. Mm-hmm. I think it should be a reformed UN, and that it should have serious forces at its disposal to intervene in time. I think Rwandas and Darfurs of our time cannot happen. So I am just as ashamed that we didn't intervene in Rwanda as I'm ashamed of the kind of intervention we did in Iraq. I don't think the U.S. can intervene, how should I put it, surgically or properly.
Right.
I think we learned the wrong lessons in Somalia.
That's floating in the back of my mind because everything you're talking, I want to apply a little bit to the situation in Iraq, because you have Saddam Hussein who's on trial right now, but not at The Hague. He's on trial in Baghdad. Why is that? What's the difference?
I frankly would be happier if he was in front of an international court, which had some international legitimacy. Remember, the Hague trial is not the U.S. trial. It is a UN trial. And the fact that they are learning with it, how to, and I don't think they'll do the thing that they do in Milosevic much longer, is very good. But we need that kind of a forum. We need a forum that says there's a rule of law in international affairs, and that there are teeth behind it. I'm a realist enough to think that, you know, it can't be just goody-goody stuff. But the difficulty is, how the hell do you apply that law if it doesn't apply to the one remaining superpower?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And, you know, that obviously puts its legitimacy in question. If you could say, well, we're going to apply that law, but not to U.S., not to Russia, not to China, not to Pakistan and India, you know, and the small fry if it's reasonably cheap, and there's some oil to make it worthwhile. Now, mind you, I do not think that the intervention in Yugoslavia was for oil. I think that that's bullshit, and that is the love that people have of various conspiracy theories. Milosevic was not a left-winger. He was not a socialist, just because the party called itself that. He was very much into a market economy. He was very much into new buddy capitalism that's growing in Eastern Europe. He was extremely corrupt. And the workers were crushed under Milosevic. The unions had no rights whatsoever, and the standard of living went right down. While people were making millions in Serbia, the working class wage went down to $100 a month. Noam Chomsky on this is, in my opinion, badly misinformed, because he relies on Ed Herman and Diana Johnson, who are fans of a version of Yugoslav communism which never existed. Diana Johnson barely will admit that maybe there were some atrocities committed by the Serbs, but then says everybody else was committing them too. Everybody else was not invading Serbia. And more to the point, there's a question of scale. The massacre in Srebrenica in Bosnia by the Serb irregulars was known by the Yugoslav army, was organized. It was not just people revenging themselves, to kill 5,000 to 8,000 people. You know, they say, well, it's not 8,000, it's more like 5. What the hell kind of an excuse is that, you know? Only 5,000 people got killed. I remember being in a debate about the Holocaust, where some quasi-deniers were saying, well, they didn't kill 6 million Jews, they only killed 4. I said, look, let's be satisfied with one thing. The Nazis did their level best. They were unhappy they couldn't do a better job. And the Serbs did their level best. So maybe in Srebrenica they only killed 5,000 or 6,000 because they didn't use gas chambers, and it was handwork, which is always more inefficient. But they did have tactics to make mass graves. They did grind up the bodies in a local meat factory. They did hide the graves all over, which shows that it was a planned thing. In Kosovo also, they said they only found X number of bodies. But then they kept digging up Albanians buried under police stations in North Serbia. The Serbs were conscious that crimes were being committed, that is the Serb police and the military and establishment. Now let me be very clear. I don't believe in national guilt. There were massive resistances of various kinds to Milosevic and to the war. 100,000 young men deserted from the army from Belgrade alone, refused to serve. There were massive anti-war rallies and so on. They didn't get much support from abroad. Even to this date, for example, when people want to fight for a more democratic Serbia or Croatia or Bosnia, it's extremely difficult to get support because the European community and the UN insists on respecting sovereignty of these goddamn states, and I think human rights beat sovereignty any time.
What about the current situation? Because you had over 100,000 people coming out for the funeral, and then you had many news reports that say that, that the Serbian people have not, quote unquote, learned their lesson, that they are still very nationalistic, and someone like Milosevic could be reelected.
There is something to that. There is something to the fact that the most nationalist party in Serbia, the Radical Party, which is for a greater Serbia, which is to say Serbia plus Bosnia plus parts of Croatia plus Kosovo, gets roughly a third of the votes, which is a serious thing that I worry about, and my activists, my NGO activists, are frightened to death of. On the other hand, it is also true that there are two Serbias. There is a democratic Serbia, which has a thin majority and would have more if it had support from the West, which it doesn't. There is a stick but not a carrot. And for the ordinary workers and peasants and pensioners, it's not at all clear that getting into the European community would improve their living standards quickly enough. It's not at all clear that the market is necessarily linked with liberalism and democracy, and it is not at all clear that democracy without improving economic situations produces the desirable results. Democracy elected Hamas among the Palestinians, and democracy elects right-wing nationalists in Poland, in Serbia, in Romania, and dubious people in the rest of former communist countries. Democracy is not an abstract good. So to make democratic values real, they have to be associated with the improvement of the living conditions of the people involved. They have so far not been. Most people who are anti-communist, people who go to rallies denouncing the old communist regime, when answering polls, say that they lived much better in the last years of Tito's regime than any time since. And that's true in Serbia, that's true in Croatia, that's certainly true in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Macedonia. Last thing that I want to emphasize here. I don't like the word genocide. I think it has been abused, and it's still being abused. I think there was a genocide against the Jews. There was a genocide against the Armenians. The other cases were not genocide. They're evil mass killings, mass murder, which is a crime for which you should pay. But I think that the Serbs engaged in mass murder, as did the Croats engaged in mass murder, not in genocide. I think it cheapens the term and confuses the thing. The Serbs, let's be very clear, they don't want to wipe out all the Bosnians. They wanted them out of the territories which they wanted. That's not genocide. It's a terrible war crime, but it's not genocide. In Serbia, I accept the argument that to do better would mean to jeopardize stability, but I'm afraid they'll have to do better. You can't have people walking around with World War II slogans, glorifying World War II fascist militias in a country that pretends to be democratic and wants to be a part of Europe. I think that they're beginning to grasp it, that communist Yugoslavia at least was clear on that thing, on the anti-fascist tradition. And
so we're going a little too long, but it's interesting to me. Did in the end, did Hitler win? Did Germany win in the end?
No, they did not win. But did Hitler tap some extremely deep-rooted sentiments? Yes. Let's remember that after Hitler's defeat, there were terrible pogroms in Poland against the Jews. That anti-Semitism in Ukraine grew, didn't diminish. That Stalin started on an anti-Semitic rampage, that the treatment of gypsies remains absolutely outrageous in Eastern Europe to this very day, and that ethnic hatreds are slowly being controlled. Having said that, I don't want people to love each other necessarily. I want them to not kill each other and mistreat each other. I used to tell people in Yugoslavia, look, the Jews, the Poles, and the Italians, and the blacks in Brooklyn don't love each other. They can't kill each other without the police intervening. So you don't gotta date his sister. You don't have to you have to work together. And we have indications that that works. During the worst riots in Detroit, race riots in Detroit, the blacks and the whites who were rioting in the streets worked side by side in the factories because their union said, anybody starts a race thing here, they'll never work in auto industry again. Yeah, oddly enough,
That works.
it works.
Right.
Well, thank you so
Yes,
much.
thank you
really
very much,
appreciate
yes.
your time and your wonderful insights.
Let them talk if they want to. Talk don't bother me. I want the whole wide world to know that I love you so. Let them whisper, for they know not what's between you and I. I'll keep on loving you until the day I die. They're trying to break up our romance, but they don't have a chance. We have the kind of love that's so strong. We'll be together from now on. Idle gossip comes from the devil's workshop.